Can you believe that a creature never given a name by humans could forgive? On a cold spring night in the wild Ouachita Mountains of Arkansas, a baby Bigfoot was born, only to lose its mother hours later, her foot mangled by a rusty human trap, forgotten deep in the woods. The tribe gathered in silence, bound by an ancient law. For one full moon, no one would call the child by name to let the mother's spirit find peace. So the little one grew up never hearing anyone speak to it, not even once. But what if I told you, this isn't just a legend? That deep in the forest, Bigfoot clans mourn, protect, exile, and sometimes forgive. This story comes from the personal account of Marianne Holt, a rural nurse whose life was forever changed the moment she met a dying young Bigfoot beneath a fallen tree and chose to sit, not run. In the next few minutes, you'll witness how an outcast found a family, not by birth, but by choice. You'll feel how the simple act of calling someone by name can change everything. And perhaps you'll start to wonder, how many lost voices out there are just waiting to be heard? Now tell me, dear listener, where are you watching from? What's your name? And how far do you think this story can go? If this touched something in you, like it did for me, please give it a like and subscribe so we can grow a gentle community that believes in stories like this. Stories of healing, belonging, and Bigfoot. From my heart to yours, thank you for being here. Rain had come early that spring. Not the playful kind that danced off tin roofs or slipped between oak leaves like silver whispers. This rain fell heavy, straight, cold. It turned the ridges of the Ouachita Mountains into black silhouettes, blurred and shifting behind mist and pine. Wind stirred the treetops like ghosts not yet ready to sleep. The forest, always humming with night creatures this time of year, held its breath. No frogs, no owls, no distant calls from coyotes across the hollows, only the steady falling hush of water, soaking everything. Somewhere deep in a crease of rock, in a narrow canyon hidden beneath bent cedar and split shale, something ancient stirred. A female Bigfoot, her fur dark and matted from birth sweat and storm, clung to a crack in the stone. Her hands, thick-fingered and trembling, dug into lichen-covered edges as her body arched once more, forcing out the last push. Then stillness, a soundless moment, and then a soft thud. She didn't cry out. She couldn't. Her breath came in sharp bursts, shallow and urgent, like someone trying to stay above rising water. Beneath her, slick with newness and trembling against the stone, was a newborn, small for its kind. Its chest rose unevenly. No sound, no wail, not even a gasp. It moved, just slightly. The mother turned her head slowly, not with wonder but with pain. Her eyes were clouded. The whites yellowed. Her right leg, twisted beneath her, bore a deep scar where once a rusted bear trap had clamped into flesh. The wound had closed, but crooked. Infection still lingered beneath the surface. She'd walked too far in too much pain, carrying a life inside her while death chased her heels. The rain did not stop. Hours passed. Time was strange in the wilderness. Some say it breathes, expands and contracts depending on who's watching. By the time the others came, the moon had pushed past a wall of clouds. It hovered low, yellow and swollen, just above the horizon, watching like a witness that would never testify. They came without sound. Shadows first, then shape. Tall forms moved between trees, one by one, not disturbing even the smallest fern. Dozens of them, all furred, all massive, but none stepped too close. They formed a circle around her body, around the child. A ceremony without words, a farewell no human tongue could echo. Some carried faint scents of moss and wood smoke. Others bore thick strands of bark braided into their fur. One held a handful of stones, smooth and warm from their cave homes, which they placed near the mother's feet. No one reached for the baby. Not yet, because this was the law. The law of silence. When a child loses its mother, its name cannot be spoken for an entire moon. If it's named too soon, if any voice gives it shape, then the soul of the mother might never leave, might linger, might not cross over the hidden paths only the old ones remembered. And so they waited, standing in stillness. The baby moved again, weakly, its fingers stretched. It did not cry, not because it was too frail, but because no one would answer. A young male, lean and restless, shifted from foot to foot at the edge of the gathering. His shoulders hunched, his breath short. He looked at the child, then away, then again. His eyes were uncertain. Too much death made some Bigfoot uneasy. Too much waiting. And something in that child, in its quiet movements, made him bristle. He stepped back, then turned, and walked away into the trees. No one followed him. Some laws, even in grief, left no room for interruption. The old ones remained. One of them, a towering female with graying fur and eyes that had seen 5 generations, stepped forward last. She had known loss, once, long ago. A child who never grew teeth, never made it through the second winter. That memory, though hidden, still beat inside her chest like a second heart. She moved slowly, kneeled beside the body, placed one hand gently over the mother's eyes, closing them. Then, after a moment's hesitation, she leaned forward and pressed her brow to the child's. A single, slow breath passed between them. Not ownership, not motherhood, but permission. The child belonged to no one. But tonight, it would not be alone. Lightning cracked far in the distance, tearing open the sky just long enough to reveal every shape in the circle, all facing inward. And then, as one, the figures began to melt back into the woods, swallowed by fern and fog and rain. Quiet as they'd come, the clearing remained. The child lay still beside the body. No one named it, no one wept. But far at the tree line, where wilderness began to forget itself and brush against the edge of old farmland, someone watched. Not something, someone. A man, middle-aged, gaunt, worn denim jacket clinging to narrow shoulders, mud to the ankles, a gas lantern in one hand, held low. The other hand rested on the head of a rifle he didn't raise. He'd been out looking for mushrooms or maybe squirrels. He wasn't sure anymore. His stomach was empty, his boots soaked. He didn't understand what he was seeing. A dead animal? No, not animal. The child lifted its head, only slightly, and in that instant, the man met its gaze, and he staggered back, because what he saw wasn't a beast, not something to run from or shoot. What he saw was eyes, deep, black, reflective like wet onyx, but behind them was recognition, not of him, of something more ancient. And then the man did what most would do. He left, turned and walked the way he came, heart hammering, breath uneven, pretending he saw nothing, that he didn't carry the image of those eyes into every dream for years after. Back in the clearing, dawn came slow, not golden and triumphant, but cold and gray. Fog clung low to the forest floor. The smell of wet earth rose. The mother's body had already begun to cool. The child, too weak to move now, barely shifted with breath, until a shadow returned. The old female, alone this time. She approached, not in silence, but with purpose. Her hands cradled something, a folded length of moss and bark, woven tight into a cradle shape. She placed it beside the child, scooped it gently, cradled it against her chest. The baby didn't resist, didn't cry. Its head fell against her shoulder like it already knew the rhythm of her heartbeat. They disappeared into the trees before full daylight reached the ground. Hours later, the rain stopped. Birdsong returned. Wind moved again through the pine, but no one else came, and by dusk the clearing was empty, except for a smooth ring of stones and a dark shape in the moss that once was a mother. And so the child, unnamed, unclaimed, not forgotten, left the place where it had begun. It would not return, not for a long time, but the forest remembered. It always does. And as the sun dropped below the far ridge and painted the tips of the Ouachitas in brief, fading gold, the trees exhaled, Somewhere, deep beneath the roots, the ground shifted softly. Nothing ever dies in silence. Not really. It only waits to be called again. But no one spoke the name, not yet. Not until the moon changed, and the silence, for now, held. Spring drifted into summer like smoke through pine needles, slow and without permission. The rains eased. The forest dried just enough for the soil to crack underfoot, just enough for things buried to rise again. In the heart of the Ouachitas, wildflowers bloomed along forgotten paths, and the wind tasted warmer, though never fully safe. And somewhere deep within it all, the child grew, not by much, not yet, but enough to move. Enough to climb low branches and drag fingertips across moss. Enough to press its ear against the belly of the earth and hear something no one else could. Still, even with motion in its limbs and breath in its lungs, the forest around it never fully opened. It watched, it tolerated, it did not welcome. The Bigfoot who had taken it in, the old female with the silver-streaked fur and the quiet, grieving eyes. She gave what she could. She gathered honeycombs in cracked bark bowls and fed it by hand. She hummed in low frequencies when storms came near, and she held it when the night turned colder than it should have been for June. But love in their kind had rules, and one of those rules was distance. Others in the clan, especially the males, especially the ones who still carried the smell of the last winter, kept away. They did not hurt it, but they did not look long, did not let it near their young. Some would growl, not deep but firm, when it ventured too close during gathering hours or tried to mimic their silent hunts through thick fern. One of them, a broad-shouldered male with a slash of old scar across his chest, made a point to rise whenever the child approached. An unspoken gesture, a wall. The child noticed. It didn't understand, but it noticed. It began to roam. First, just near the stream where birds came to bathe. Then further, past the rock shelves where frogs clung beneath damp overhangs. Through shadowed corridors of pine and sassafras, following smells it didn't yet know how to name. And always, the forest remained just beyond reach. Every time it tried to play, shaking wet branches, darting toward deer, it felt the woods pull back, like water from a stone too cold to hold. It would sit sometimes for hours, watching the light change through the canopy, blinking less than it should. No sound, no movement, just breath, just waiting. But for what? It couldn't have said. Farther off, on the edge of a thinning tree line where the forest gave way to rough pasture and clapboard fences held together by rusted nails, Daisy Klein wandered barefoot in a skirt too short for her age and boots too worn for the season. 11, maybe 12. A child, but already carrying the posture of someone who'd been told no more times than yes. Her long brown hair was usually tangled, tied back with whatever ribbon or fishing line she could find. Her house sat on an old hog farm that hadn't seen hogs in 5 years. A roof patchworked with tin, a porch held up by spite and stubborn beams. Her mother had died when she was 6. Pneumonia or something close enough. Folks in town said it was just bad luck and poor timing. Her father never said anything at all. Just tightened the belt, got quieter, and worked until his fingers cracked from handling barbed wire and wet wood. Daisy didn't mind much. She knew when to disappear. She liked the woods, or maybe she needed them, most evenings after supper. Once the tools were cleaned and her chores done, she'd slip past the fence line with a flashlight that only worked when you hit it twice and a biscuit in her pocket. She never meant to go far, but each time she wandered just a little deeper. There was something about the hush between trees that made her chest feel less tight. And sometimes, if she was lucky, she'd find something strange. A feather too big for any bird she knew. Bark peeled in patterns like symbols, footprints where no shoes had been. One afternoon, not long after the humidity started curling the pages of her school books, Daisy knelt beside a muddy creek bend and found a track. 3 toes, broad, deep. It wasn't fresh, but it was clear. Not raccoon, not bear. She reached out and laid her hand inside it. It made hers look like a child's drawing beside an adult's handprint on a fridge door. She didn't tell her daddy. She didn't tell anyone. Instead, she came back the next day, and the day after that. On the 4th day, just past the spot where sweet gum trees grew in a tight crescent, she saw it. Not clearly, but enough. A shape across the creek, half hidden in brush. It moved slow, deliberate, not like an animal, not like anything she'd ever seen in her books. Tall, but not tall like a man. Thicker, covered in something dark and matted, but not dirty. Alive in a way she couldn't explain. She ducked low, heart banging like a screen door in wind, and peeked over a fallen log. The thing was crouched now, looking at water, fingers touching the surface. It wasn't drinking. It was watching its own reflection. And then, as if pulled by some invisible string, it turned. Their eyes met. She didn't scream. She didn't run. She just stared. Because what she saw staring back wasn't a monster. It wasn't even a creature. It was something else. Something not meant to be alone. Then it was gone. The trees swallowed it, as if it had never been there. That night, Daisy couldn't sleep. Rain came again. Light, intermittent. A soft tapping against the roof. She lay on her mattress in the corner room, listening too hard. And that's when she heard it. Not thunder, not branches. Footsteps. Heavy, not fast, not crashing, just slow, careful. Outside her window. She sat up, heart in her throat. The sound faded. She didn't tell her father. She knew what he'd say. That she was making things up again. That the woods filled kids' heads with nonsense. But she knew what she'd heard. In the woods, not far from her home, the child stood in the rain. Alone. Its shoulders slumped beneath the weight of something it couldn't name. Not sadness exactly. Not pain. But absence. The kind of absence that makes even the wind feel like it's pushing you away. It had tried to stay with the others, tried to be quiet, tried to match their stillness. But every time it moved, something shifted. Their glances, their postures, as if it carried a crackle that disturbed the silence they needed to breathe. Even its mother. No, not its mother, but the one who held it now, had begun pulling back. Gently, but firm. Letting it eat second. Letting it sleep near, but not beside. She never growled, never struck. But the message had been passed. The clan had spoken. Keep space. Something was coming. They didn't say it aloud. They never did. But the forest knew. The trees leaned in. The birds moved earlier than usual. The ground had gone still in places where it should have hummed. That night, when the others nested in the upper hollows, the child found a spot beneath a bent cedar and curled into itself. Rain fell soft. A chill moved in through its fur. It didn't cry, not even when sleep wouldn't come. It just lay there, listening. By morning, the cedar was empty. No tracks, no prints, no warmth left behind. And on the edge of the clearing, the old female stood, eyes scanning the dark. She didn't call out. She couldn't. The law held, but something in her posture shifted. Attention, not fear, but knowing. In the distance, a crow screamed. Farther still, something else moved, and the forest, once again, went quiet. The forest woke before the sun. A thin mist drifted low across the ground, curling around tree trunks like a breath held too long. Light hadn't touched the ridges yet, but the birds were already whispering. Wind stirred just enough to rustle the ferns. Somewhere, far off, a woodpecker tapped its steady rhythm into an old pine, and in the cradle of that waking silence, the child was gone. The hollow where it had curled the night before, under a bent cedar near the others, lay empty. A few scattered needles, no prints, The old female stood a few paces away, unmoving. Her back faced the rising light, her head tilted slightly, as if listening to something no one else could hear. Not panic, not grief. Just stillness. The others said nothing. They did not call out. There was no ceremony for this kind of leaving. The child had simply walked into the forest, alone. It hadn't meant to. The night before had felt too long, the air too close, the weight of glances too heavy. It had tried to sleep, but something in its chest wouldn't settle. A pull, faint but insistent, like a thread tugging at the back of its mind. So before the dew had formed and before the light had shifted, it stood up. No sound, no farewell, just one foot in front of the other, past the tree line, past the stream, past the boundary the others never explained but always honored. At first, it had felt like freedom. But hunger comes quiet, and thirst doesn't ask permission. By mid-morning, the child's steps had slowed. The canopy thinned, letting shafts of sunlight cut through the green. Its breath came shorter now, nostrils flaring. It searched for berries, for roots, for anything. But this part of the forest was different, drier. The earth beneath its feet crunched. No moss, no hum. It paused beside a dry stream bed. Once a place of water, now just stone and silence. It knelt, touched the dust with open palms, then pressed its lips to the empty channel, hoping. Nothing. Just the taste of grit and old bark. The wind shifted. It stood again. Something moved behind it. Too quiet, too slow. The child turned. Nothing. But something had changed. The birds had stopped. There were no branches swaying, no leaves trembling, only a scent, sharp, heavy, thick like copper and cold meat. It wasn't alone anymore. Up along the slope, near a crooked ash tree, the wolves had found the trail. Not many, just 3. Lean, pale-coated, moving like smoke, low to the ground. Their eyes were hollow with hunger. Their breath short. They hadn't come for challenge. They'd come for opportunity. The child stepped back, then again, then turned and ran. The ground was uneven, slick with dry needles. Each footfall threw up dust. Its limbs were long now, but not strong. Not yet. Its chest ached. Breath burst too fast, too loud. It ducked through fallen branches, scraped its arm against a splintered trunk, stumbled once, caught itself, kept going. The forest closed around it. Shadows deepened. The wolves followed. Not fast, not loud, but sure. 100 yards behind them, deeper still in the trees. Others watched. They had been watching since before the child woke. Silhouettes among pine, faces hidden in leaves. The old female, the scarred male, the youngest one with ash-colored fur. They had followed at a distance, not because they were told to, because they knew they must. Something had shifted. The child had stepped into a place where even the law began to bend. But they could not interfere. Not yet. The child stumbled again. A root caught its foot. It crashed hard against a fallen log, breath knocked out. Dirt filled its nose. Its chest heaved. Behind it, closer now, pads on the ground. It rolled. The first wolf broke the tree line, yellow eyes locked. But before it lunged, a growl. Not from the wolves, not from the child. It came from the shadows. A shape stepped forward. Larger, darker. The scarred male. The one who'd once looked away. Who'd once left the circle early. His shoulders rose. His jaw opened just enough to show teeth that weren't for show. His growl deepened. Steady. Controlled. The ground beneath him seemed to pulse. The wolves froze, then scattered. No chase, no blood, just presence. He looked at the child. Not long, then turned, and vanished again. The child didn't rise right away. Its body ached. Its chest still struggled. But its eyes, they changed. And something in its limbs decided forward, not back. It moved slower now. No longer running, just walking, one step at a time, toward the edge of the forest, toward where the scent changed, where the air held smoke and salt, and something that didn't belong to the trees. The sun was dipping now, casting gold across the hills. At the edge of the pasture, Daisy stood with a tin cup in her hand. She wasn't supposed to be there. She had told her father she was going to feed the chickens, but instead, she'd filled the cup from the pump and slipped past the gate, carrying a biscuit in her other hand. She didn't know why. She didn't have a plan. But ever since the night she'd heard the steps, ever since she saw that shape across the creek, something inside her stayed restless. She felt it before she saw it. A change in the air, the way silence grew thick, not empty. She turned slowly. There it was, walking toward her across the open space just beyond the first fence post, covered in dirt. Legs scratched, chest rising too fast. It didn't look like it had eaten in days. Its eyes locked on the cup in her hand. She didn't move. She didn't speak. She just watched. It stumbled once, caught itself, then stopped, 10 feet away, closer than before. The wind tugged her skirt. A cloud passed over the sun. Time felt strange. She raised the cup. The child didn't reach for it, just stared. Then, legs giving out, it collapsed. Right there, under the edge of a leaning oak, beside a pile of leaves and the start of a gopher trail, the child dropped. Not asleep, not unconscious, just done. Its body went still. Its breath barely moved the dust. Not far behind her, the screen door of the house creaked open. Daisy flinched. Her father's voice, rough and low, cut across the air. "What are you doing out there?" She turned, hiding the cup behind her back. "Nothing." He squinted. "That your water?" She nodded. He stared a long time, then closed the door. Inside, the air stayed thick. Outside, the child lay in a pile of dirt and pine, unmoving. From the edge of the woods, hidden just enough, someone else watched. A woman. Her coat was old, patched in places with canvas and thread. Her boots sunk into moss as she stepped forward slowly, each movement deliberate. She didn't carry a weapon, didn't raise her voice. She just stood, 10 steps away, arms loose at her sides. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Because in that moment, in the dying light of an Arkansas evening, with the sky stained orange and the forest exhaling, she knew. Whatever this thing was, whatever name it didn't have, it had chosen to come to them, not because it trusted them, but because it had nowhere else left to go. And in that silence between wind and breath, something old began to shift. Something neither beast nor human. A beginning that didn't feel like one, yet couldn't be anything else. The ground hadn't moved for hours. Not beneath the leaves, not beneath the air. It was that particular kind of stillness only summer could shape, when the heat had crept just deep enough into the roots that even the trees stopped whispering. The light was gold by then, stretched long across the clearing, soft at the edges like an old memory. And in the center of it, beneath the bowed limbs of an oak that had survived more storms than any man nearby could name, the child lay curled and unmoving. Its limbs were splayed, not in pain but surrender, not unconscious but empty, breathing shallow. Dirt clung to its fur in patches, caked dry along its arms and legs. The skin beneath had gone pale in places, cracked. In the crook of its neck, an old scar, faint as a whisper. Its chest barely lifted with each breath. Whatever it had been running from, whatever it had been running toward, it hadn't found either. It had simply stopped. 10 paces away, the woman stood still. She hadn't meant to be there, not exactly. Marianne Holt hadn't meant much of anything for a long time now. 56 years on this earth, and she still couldn't say what her life had been about. A nurse once, a wife, a porch sitter, a coffee sipper, someone who learned to keep her hands busy so her mind didn't drift too far. Since her husband died, most days felt like echoes. She worked at the clinic 3 days a week now, took blood pressure for the old farmers who still chewed tobacco and smelled like feed sacks. She watered her tomatoes, swept the porch, refilled the hummingbird feeders. She didn't need anyone, but that wasn't the same as not wanting someone. Once, years ago, she had taken care of a boy for almost 9 months. He wasn't hers, but he'd needed somewhere safe for a while, and she had the room. The boy had big eyes and used to ask her what clouds were made of. She'd let herself believe for a minute that he might stay, that maybe someone had finally needed her for good. Then the court changed its mind. She'd sat in silence as they handed him back to people who didn't deserve him. No goodbyes. Just a cardboard box of the toys he left behind, and the way the house felt louder without his footsteps. She hadn't let herself get close to anyone since. Until now. Now she was staring at something the rest of the world would have run from. It didn't look like a storybook monster. It didn't look like something science could name. It looked like something that didn't belong anywhere anymore. A small creature built to be large. A child built to survive what had killed its mother, its kind, or both. But what struck her wasn't the size. It wasn't the strangeness. It was the way it had laid down, like it had given up asking to be helped. So she stepped forward, one boot in the dirt, then another. No sudden moves, no noise. She moved like someone who remembered what fear could do to fragile things. The child didn't lift its head. She lowered herself slowly, joints crackling in the heat, until she was sitting on the dry earth not far from it. She didn't reach out, didn't speak, just sat. Long minutes passed. The child stirred, just barely. Then, without lifting its head, it shifted, an inch closer, one hand dragging softly through the dust. Not toward her, just toward warmth. She said nothing. She laid one hand on the ground, palm up, fingers relaxed. She'd done this before, with dogs hit by cars, with kids too scared to trust a stranger, with her own hands when they trembled after the funeral. The wind picked up just enough to rustle the hem of her coat. The child blinked. Then again, and then it moved. Not fast, not bold, but sure. It crawled toward her, stopped, then reached out and placed its hand, much too large for its size, right over hers. Their skin didn't match. Nothing about them matched. But in that moment, neither of them flinched. A sound came from behind them. Crunch of underbrush. A shape. Marnie didn't look back. She didn't have to. She knew. There was something behind her. Bigger, watching, testing. She didn't move, didn't speak. She kept her palm flat, her posture open. If they wanted to harm her, they would have done it already. So she trusted stillness. A breath passed, then another. She felt it before she saw it. The way the presence behind her stepped back. Not far, but enough. Approval, or at least permission. Whatever this was, whoever they were, they had decided, for now, she could stay. She turned her head slowly, just enough to see it vanish into the trees. One final glimpse of a silhouette broader than anything human, taller than any man. The kind of figure old campfire stories tried to describe, but always missed. Then gone. The child had slumped now, forehead resting against her leg. She didn't cry. She didn't smile. She just looked down at it, and slowly, carefully, pulled off the jacket she wore, the old canvas one with the tear at the elbow and the faded patch from her husband's hunting days, and draped it across the child's back. It twitched once, then stilled. She let her hand rest there, not to claim, just to protect. The sky began to dim, the sun slipping faster now beyond the far ridge. Crickets began their low hum. Something flapped far above in the canopy. The world moved on, unaware of what had just been given, or what had just been allowed. For Marnie, the silence was no longer empty. It was full. The child slept, or something close to it, and in the darkening woods, between moss and memory, the woman stayed sitting. She didn't ask herself what it was. She didn't ask what it meant. She just stayed, because that's what the moment required. And somewhere beyond the line of pine, tucked behind rock formations half swallowed by years of wind and rain, metal caught the last light of the sun, a soft glint, faint, forgotten, a piece of rusted steel shaped like a jaw, half buried in soil that once soaked up blood. The trap was still there, waiting. The sun never quite reached the floor of that valley. Light slipped through in shards, bent by the thick canopy of pine and hickory that rose like cathedral walls on every side. The place smelled like sap and iron-rich water, and the moss underfoot grew thick enough to silence even the largest steps. It wasn't on any map. No path led there. Not even the animals passed through often. And yet, it felt inhabited. Not marked by ownership. Marked by memory. They brought the child there on the second morning, just after the mist had lifted and the heat hadn't yet pressed down. The old female led, her pace slow but certain. Two others flanked them, taller, broader, faces older. One bore a series of smooth stones tied with vine around his wrist. The other carried nothing at all, but kept glancing over his shoulder like something might follow. They made no sound between them. Only the child's steps dragged, a little too heavy, still not healed from the journey before. The trees opened. The valley waited. There was no fanfare, no call, just silence, and then the stir of something ahead. She emerged from the ferns like a whisper. Another female, strong and lithe, fur the color of dry clay, eyes sharp with the clarity of one who's raised more than her share. At her side, tucked behind her leg and peeking with a curiosity too large to be contained, was another youngling. Nearly the same age, taller though, thicker arms, a flash of teeth behind the fur that looked more grin than snarl. The child froze. So did the other. There was a long pause between them. A scan, not of threat, but of territory. The child tilted its head, uncertain. The valley felt different. The air here didn't resist, but it didn't invite either. Then the other youngling stepped forward. Just one stride, close enough to be felt, and shoved. Not hard, just enough to send a message. This is mine. The child stumbled back a step, caught its balance. Didn't respond, didn't push, didn't bare teeth. Just looked and stepped aside. The older female let out a low sound, almost a breath, almost approval. She approached, placed her hand gently on the first child's shoulder, then on her own youngling's chest. A signal. Stand down. The younger one looked away, chest puffed, but didn't challenge again. The old one who'd brought the child waited, watched, then nodded once, and left. The others followed, leaving the child behind. The valley was no cage, but it wasn't freedom either. It was something in between. Days passed with no rhythm. Time stretched and folded. The two younglings circled each other like storm clouds. Sometimes playing, sometimes posturing, mostly ignoring. The older female kept them both close, but there was a difference in how she touched them. Her child leaned into her without hesitation. The orphan stayed near, but never quite touched. That night, after a slow day of foraging near the edge of a spring-fed pool, something shifted. The three of them returned to the central space of the valley, where the ground flattened and the moss grew in concentric rings like a forgotten garden. The older female dropped to her knees and motioned both children forward. At first the orphan hesitated, then stepped close. The other youngling sat too, and then, quietly, slowly, she leaned forward and pressed her forehead against the orphan's. One breath, then two. Their lungs synchronized, not perfectly, but enough. A rhythm, a meeting, an acceptance not as family, not yet, but as allowed. The older female reached her hand toward the child's chest and exhaled once. That was the closest thing to a name the child had ever received. Night came, not with peace, but with weight. Somewhere far beyond the valley walls, thunder cracked. Not sky thunder, not from clouds, a different kind. Distant, man-made. The sound rolled down through the hills like a warning, carried on the back of a breeze that smelled like oil and metal. The younglings flinched. The older female stood, head turned toward the north, her body rigid. She didn't run, but she moved faster than before, her steps no longer silent. She gathered the two close, led them to a shelter made of limbs and bark, covered the entrance with ferns. The child lay beside the other for the first time, still not touching, but closer, A branch snapped high in the trees, then silence again. In the space between sleep and waking, the child felt something strange in its chest. Not fear, not quite. Something quieter, like the memory of a lullaby it had never been sung. Miles away, on the edge of a clearing lit by pale moonlight and cigarette smoke, Marianne Holt stood on her porch in her nightgown, a flashlight in one hand, the other curled tight around the banister. She hadn't meant to cry, but there it was anyway, a quiet weep, one that didn't reach the chest, just the eyes. She had given the child up, not because she was told to, because she had known. Some things aren't meant to belong to us, no matter how much we want to keep them. She'd watched them come that morning. 4 shapes in the trees. One stayed back. The other stepped forward. They hadn't spoken, but the space around them had done the talking. A presence like gravity, the kind that made animals freeze, the kind that made you feel like kneeling. She had laid her coat on the ground, stepped back, and waited. The old female had approached first. Not fast, not threatening, just steady. She had looked at Marianne for a long time. Marianne hadn't looked away. They had understood each other. Loss recognizes loss. And then they had taken the child, not with force, not with fear, but with purpose. Now, hours later, the porch light flickered. The flashlight stayed off. Marianne sat in the rocker, one hand in her lap, the other pressed to her lips. She didn't say a word. Didn't need to. Across the yard, past the well, in the trees, something shifted. A figure too large for the trail stood still, watching, then disappeared. No sound, no break, just gone. She didn't follow. Back in the valley, the 2 younglings stirred. A rustle, then stillness. Outside their shelter, the sky cracked again. Far off, the sound of metal clinking against rock. Then silence, but it didn't last. By morning, the forest would know. By morning, the old female would call others. By morning, things would move. And from a high ridge above the valley, hidden behind a split tree and binoculars that had seen too many winters, a man in a frayed jacket wrote a note into a leather book. 1 sentence, 1 word underlined: alive. The trap was older than memory. Half rusted, half buried, almost invisible beneath the rot and moss. Tucked at the base of a black gum tree along a game trail no one used anymore. But it was still there. The steel jaws open just enough to whisper the kind of silence that carries danger. No markings, no flags, just waiting, still ready. Clay Rooker remembered exactly where he left it. He crouched beside it that morning, hands on his knees, sweat collecting at his collar. The air was thick. His shirt clung to him. A breeze stirred once through the underbrush, just enough to carry the smell of sulfur from his boots and the grease he still rubbed into the gunmetal every Sunday. He didn't look proud of what he saw, but he didn't look guilty either. It had been 17 years since he set the first one. Back then, he was younger, faster, full of a kind of certainty that men in old towns mistake for purpose. He told himself it was for deer, for predators, for protecting the line of hens his daddy had raised behind chicken wire and faith. But that wasn't true. Even then, it had been about something else. Proof. Worth. A chance to say to the world, I saw it. I brought it back. I matter. Now the traps were back. Not because he wanted money, but because time had run out. His son's cough had turned to something worse. A slow wasting. The kind the doctors in Hot Springs couldn't name without insurance. The kind that got real quiet in the bones first, then took the breath in inches. Clay had sat beside that bed for 6 nights straight, counting the seconds between wheezes, watching the boy's ribs move like broken shutters. He wasn't a monster. He was a father. And fathers fix things, or die trying. So he stood now, looking at that old metal with a camera in his backpack and a plan in his head. Not to catch one, no. That was suicide. But a photo, a lock of fur, a trail cam hit. Just enough to sell to someone who wanted more than stories. And someone always wanted more than stories. He reached down, tested the spring. Still worked. Back in the valley, the tension hadn't lifted since the night of the shot. The older female kept the 2 younglings close, even during feeding. No wide foraging now. No tree play. No deep forest wandering. She'd moved them up the slope of the eastern ridge, closer to the caves with the wide mouths and sharp air, where echoes could warn of feet approaching. The other clans had begun to stir. More figures than usual in the trees. The kind that watched but didn't show. Even the scarred male returned. He didn't speak. He just stood near the edge of the tree line and waited. When the child stepped too far one afternoon, the older female didn't scold. She simply looked, eyes low and fixed, and the child understood. Return. Stay within. Don't make the forest choose again. But something had changed. The forest felt different. Not in the bark or the sky, but in the weight of things. The way birds stilled. The way deer paused mid-step. The way no one moved too quickly anymore, like some ancient clock had begun ticking again after decades of silence. And Marnie felt it too. She had spent the past few days walking her own property like it was new land. The woods behind her house seemed narrower somehow, less forgiving. She carried her old thermos now, not for coffee but for keeping her hands busy. The shotgun stayed near the door, though she hadn't loaded it in years. And every time she stepped outside, she listened longer. She was the kind of woman who noticed things, and the things she noticed now didn't sit right. She found tracks near the edge of the creek. Man-made boots. Heavy heel. Not Daisy's, not hers. Fresh. Too fresh. Someone had been moving through her woods, not hunting deer. No blood, no signs of bait, just circles. Watching patterns. Then she found the trap. Not sprung, but waiting. Exactly like the one she'd pulled from the paw of a raccoon back in '86 when she still volunteered with the animal shelter. This one was meaner, heavier, bigger than what Arkansas law allowed, and stained with something darker than rust. She crouched, stared, and without hesitation, she picked it up, slung it under one arm, and carried it home. That night she opened her medicine cabinet. Not for her, but for someone else. She crushed 2 of the vials into powder, slipped them into an old Altoids tin, and pressed it into her coat pocket. Then she waited. Clay came by just before dusk. Not directly, not to the door, but near enough. She heard the engine before she saw him. That old pickup coughing like it was choking on shame. He didn't get out at first. Just sat there. One hand on the wheel, the other rubbing at the back of his neck like it itched with something he couldn't name. Then he stepped out, walked up slow. He didn't ask for anything, but she knew why he was there. She handed him the tin without a word. He looked at it, confused, then looked up at her. "You know," she said, voice calm, "I used to believe God never left anyone behind. I still want to believe that, but some days..." She didn't finish. "Didn't have to." Clay nodded once. Then he left. That night the boy coughed less, not because it was fixed, but because someone still gave a damn. In the forest, the older female paced. Something was coming. They all knew it. The others had begun to circle tighter. The elders sent no signals, but their absence meant more than presence now. The child felt it. Even the younger one, the one who used to shove, now slept closer. The clan was shifting. Preparing, and at the edge of the woods, just beyond where even the moonlight dared not fall, Clay stood again, camera in hand, not ready to press the shutter, just watching, waiting, and somewhere behind him, the sound of something breathing. Not man, not beast, just old, older than names, and too quiet to be ignored. They moved at dusk, not because they wanted to, because they had to. The sky had started bleeding orange long before the last calls of the whip-poor wills. The air was wrong. Too quiet. Too thick. It didn't feel like summer anymore. It felt like warning. Pine needles stuck to fur that hadn't been groomed. Footsteps padded softly through loam that had been dry for too many days. The forest, usually alive with whispering things, now held its breath. And so they left. Not far, not in panic, but with purpose. The old female led. Her movements deliberate, almost ceremonial. The 2 younglings stayed close to her hips, The smaller one, still unnamed, glancing back too often, dragging its steps as if the roots themselves were clinging to its ankles. A few others followed. 6 total, maybe 7. The rest had scattered the night before, slipping between ridges in 2s and 3s, sent to warn or disappear. No one said which. Only the scarred male didn't move with the group. He hung near the rear, pausing at each turn, watching the trees for what they couldn't name but knew was coming. The child didn't understand the decision. It had felt it brewing, sure. The shift in how the clan had stopped resting in one place. How even the elders had begun to carry scent marks again. But it didn't know why leaving felt like breaking. They had not told it. They never would. But it knew enough. The night before, it had crept to the edge of the sleeping ground. Not to run, just to look. The moon had been low, carved like bone, and the air carried the distant echo of something unnatural. A scent, familiar but wrong. Iron and oil and heat, men, and somewhere deeper, beneath the noise of wind and crickets, something that didn't belong. So when they rose that evening, when the lead female turned her body toward the eastern slopes and didn't look back, the child followed. But it didn't want to, and that made all the difference. Marnie had been watching the tree line since morning. She hadn't gone inside for more than a few minutes. She'd made coffee she didn't drink, moved firewood she didn't need, stood on the porch for hours just waiting. The woods were too still. That was how she knew. Something was leaving. She felt it the way old dogs know storms. By afternoon, she couldn't take it anymore. She grabbed her coat and flashlight, left a note on the table with just her name and a time, even though no one would come looking, slipped on her boots, checked the pocket where she kept the tin, then headed toward the hollow. By nightfall, the light was mostly gone. Just embers from the sky and the warm hum of fireflies dancing along the brush. She should have stopped at the creek, but she didn't. She kept walking, past the familiar bend, past the cedar stump, deeper than she had gone in years. And that's when the wolves came. Not many, just 2, but enough. They didn't howl, they didn't charge. They appeared, gray shapes woven from shadow, moving low and sure across the trail. She froze. Her breath caught halfway up her throat. The flashlight trembled in her grip, and in that heartbeat between decisions, she heard something behind her. Boots, cracking brush, clay. He stepped into view just behind her, panting, one hand raised in some old reflex he didn't think he still had. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. He leveled the flashlight toward the wolves. They paused. Their eyes reflected back the light like cold lanterns. Then, without sound, they melted away into the dark. Clay exhaled slowly. "I thought you might be out here," he said, voice low. She turned, surprised, but didn't question it. Just nodded once. "Why?" she asked. He rubbed the back of his neck. "Because I heard what's leaving, and I ain't sure I want to live in a world that lets it." Together they kept walking. The trees began to thin. Ahead the child had stopped. The rest of the group had moved on without it. The old female turned once, gave a quiet call. Not a name, just breath. But it didn't respond. It stood halfway between the ridge and the clearing, staring back toward the direction it had come. Its hands clenched. It knew what it wanted, but that didn't make it easier. It didn't want to go forward, and it didn't want to return, because neither direction was home. It made a sound, a small one, not a word, but a sound. And the forest shook. The rest of the group stopped, turned. The old female froze. The scarred male inhaled sharply. The child had broken the law. It had spoken. It had given voice to something before the moon allowed. But no one corrected it. Not this time. Because what it called for wasn't disobedience. It was belonging. And that's when the others came. The forest came alive again, but not with danger. With presence. Figures rose from shadow, stepped into moonlight. Not many, but enough. The elders, the distant watchers, even the male who had once turned his back. He came forward now, slow and uncertain, and knelt, right there in the dirt, before the child. Not in surrender, in recognition. That was the moment it had been waiting for. Not approval, Not pity. A choice. A place. Marnie stepped into the clearing just as it happened. She didn't cry, but she stopped breathing for a moment, because she saw it. The child standing at the center of something ancient and sacred. Not a creature, not a myth, but a soul finally seen. The rest of the group parted. Let it walk. It stepped forward. Not to follow, not to flee, but to stand right between them. Between the world of people and the world of silence. Between the woman who had once shielded it from rain and the clan that had carried it from grief. It looked at Marnie, then at the male still kneeling in dirt, then back again. It didn't speak, but something passed between them. And in that quiet, with nothing but wind and stars, the child waited for no command. It chose, and when it stepped back into the trees, it wasn't running. It was returning, and the forest breathed again, just as dawn began to break. The forest breathed softer that morning. Mist curled in the low hollows like steam from an old kettle, clinging to the underbrush, winding between the trees without rush. The cold hadn't left yet, but spring's weight was stirring beneath the frost. It was the kind of morning that felt like an apology, like something wild had held too tight for too long and was just now learning how to let go. And they were leaving, one by one, stepping out of the places they had slept, brushing bark from their arms, pausing only to look back at what would no longer be theirs by dusk. No urgency, no spoken word, just movement, quiet and final, like they knew how much the ground remembered, like they knew how far they could go before the memories faded behind them. The child stood last, not at the front, not in the center, but where it always had, near enough to be seen, but far enough to be let go if needed. The others had stopped keeping their distance in recent days. They'd stopped correcting its steps. The scarred male no longer looked away. The younger one who once shoved had begun to sleep with their backs touching. But even so, the space between acceptance and belonging wasn't something the child could cross alone. It waited, and no one said anything, because they'd already chosen what they could choose. The rest, the child would have to do itself. Daisy stood in her father's truck with her arms folded over the tailgate, her boots on the bumper, watching the tree line like she was expecting a ghost. She hadn't spoken much since the night she heard the sound. That low, unplaceable sound from the woods, the one that didn't belong to any animal she knew, but didn't scare her either. The one that sounded more like a name than a cry. Her father hadn't said anything either. Not when he saw her come home covered in leaves. Not when she left water out by the shed, then came back without the cup. Not even when she sat on the porch every night like she was waiting for something to end. But this morning, over a cup of instant coffee and the smell of creosote from the fencing post, she looked up at him and said what needed to be said. I saw it. And he didn't flinch, didn't scold. He just set his mug down, turned back toward the barn, and muttered the only thing a man like him could when the world started shifting faster than his mouth could follow. All right. That was his silence. That was his blessing. And that was enough. Clay had been sitting on the ridge since before dawn, wrapped in a jacket too thin for the cold and holding a photograph he didn't plan to sell. His fingers had dirt under the nails. His boots were still damp from creek mud, and the tin Marnie had given him now sat empty in his glove box. His boy had made it through the night without coughing once. He didn't ask why. Didn't pray. Didn't apologize to the air. But something inside him broke in a way that didn't bleed, just loosened. He hadn't set another trap, and he wouldn't. Not now, because there are things you take from the world, and things the world lets you keep if you're lucky. And he'd been lucky, even if he didn't deserve it. In the clearing behind Marnie's cabin, the leaves had been swept aside. Not by wind, by hands. Big hands. Careful ones. The kind that knew the shape of grief. The kind that once buried a mother beneath stone without a name to speak, and waited a season in silence just to mourn her right. There, before the porch steps, the ground had been pressed flat. The earth softened and flattened like a bed for something that would not return. A gift, or a message. Or maybe both. Marnie didn't touch it. She just saw it. And she knew. She'd woken early. Not from a dream, but from a feeling. She opened the door with her breath still caught in her throat and stepped out barefoot into the dew. The cold bit at her toes, but she didn't move. Her eyes locked on the patch of earth, and her heart did something it hadn't done in a long time. It swelled, not with hope, but with recognition. This wasn't a goodbye. It was something older, something that spoke without words, without names, without promises. She looked toward the trees and waited, not for it to come back, but for the ache to settle in the shape it left behind. The child turned once. Its eyes scanned the edge of the trees where the woman had once stood. There was no figure there now, no sound, but something lingered in the bark, in the cold, in the wind that pressed against its cheek like a mother's hand might have, if things had gone differently. It had chosen, but it could still remember, and it did. It walked, not fast, not slow, but steady. And as it moved past the last row of trees, into the deeper woods where no trail followed, it did not look back again. The rest of the clan had already disappeared into the underbrush, blending like they always had. Their sounds were soft, their steps rehearsed. Only the birds noticed now. Only the branches bowed. Dawn came slower than usual, like it too wanted to hold on, but it rose anyway, spilling gold across the low hills and painting the tops of the Ouachita pines in firelight. It was spring again, and everything that had held on through the winter was still standing. Weakened maybe, but standing. There was no ceremony, no final word, no neat ending. But Marnie stayed on her porch as long as the sun stayed low. She didn't cry. She didn't call after it. She just whispered one thing into the morning air, voice so low the wind had to lean in to hear. "Thank you." And then she sat down, not because she was tired, because she wasn't alone. Not really. Not anymore. Somewhere between pine and memory, something had shifted. Not everything needs to stay to be real, and not everything we love has to look like us. Sometimes we don't need to understand something to keep it safe. Sometimes all we need is a patch of earth smoothed by someone who never meant to stay, but stayed long enough. And sometimes that's family. Not the kind you're born into, the kind that finds you anyway. And when it does, if you're lucky and quiet and brave enough to stay still, you'll know it, even if it walks away. Sometimes the ones who stay quiet the longest are the ones carrying the deepest truths. We grow up believing that family is built by blood, held together by last names, birthdays, or old photo albums that gather dust on a shelf. But then life shows us something different. It teaches us that real family, the kind that saves you, is built in moments, in silence, in the reaching of one hand toward another with nothing promised in return. It's built in the places where love shows up without explanation and stays, even when it isn't understood. Belonging doesn't always come with a welcome sign. Sometimes it arrives as a quiet breath in the middle of a storm, a glance, a second chance, or a space made soft just enough for you to rest. The world has always tried to sort things into boxes: human, beast, wild, tame, good, bad. But the truth is, not everything can be named, and not everything that matters needs to be explained. There are souls out there, wandering, watching, waiting, who simply want to exist without being hunted, who wish only to be left in peace, or gently seen. And sometimes they're closer than we think. There is a kind of sacredness in what we don't understand, a beauty in the mystery. And the deeper you listen to the woods, to the hush between branches, the breath of wind over moss, the more you start to hear something that sounds a little like forgiveness, a little like hope. What you give in this life, especially the parts you never get back, echoes. Kindness doesn't fade. Compassion doesn't disappear just because it wasn't applauded. The smallest act of protection, even when no one is watching, can ripple through time and touch something you'll never meet. Sometimes, being there, just being there, is enough to change everything. So if you've ever felt like you didn't belong, if you've ever carried your story alone, if you've ever looked into the eyes of something wild and wondered if maybe it was looking back with the same ache you carry, know this: you're not alone. You never were. There's a place for every soul brave enough to seek it, and someone, somewhere, is waiting to meet you halfway. No names, no conditions, Just presence, just care. And maybe that's all home ever really is. Thank you for walking this path with us. If this story moved something quiet inside you, we invite you to share your thoughts in the comments. Let your voice be part of the echo. And if you haven't yet, follow the channel and subscribe to join a growing community of hearts that believe in gentleness, in wonder, and in stories that remind us we all still belong somewhere. Until next time, stay kind, stay listening, stay human.